Jó napot kívánok! Sok szeretettel köszöntöm Önöket a Mathias Corvinus Collegium könyvbemutatóján. A mai eseményünk apropója, hogy magyarul az Osiris kiadó és a Mathias Corvinus Collegium alapítvány gondozásában megjelent Rod Drehernek a Szent Benedikt válaszútján című angol száz országokban angolul sikerkönyve, immár magyarul is olvasható, és nagyon hálásak vagyunk, köszönjük, hogy a szerzővel egy ilyen együttműködést tudott kialakulni. Engem Orbán Balázsnak hívnak, én vagyok a Mathias Corvinus Collegium alapítványnak az elnöke, és egy rövid köszöntőt mondanék, aztán át is adnám a szót a szerzőnek és a mai vendégeinknek. Ez a könyv talán nem is lehetne aktuálisabb máskor, mint napjainkban. Az identitás küzdelmek korát éljük, intellektuális elbizonytalanodás időszakában vagyunk, amikor az igaz, a hamis, a fekete, a fehér, a valós és a valótlan, illetőleg a fontos és a kevésbé fontos elválasztása nem megy könnyen egymástól, legalábbis egy olyan világ van, ami megnehezíti ezeket az elhatárolásokat. Rod könyve azért fontos, mert annak a megtestesítője, hogy Magyarország jó úton jár, hogy Magyarország egy bizonytalan, egy elbizonytalanodó korban is tud a béke szigete lenni, és a Rod által elmesélt történet az tulajdonképpen arról szól, hogy ebben a nehéz időszakban is a nemzet, a család, a hit, a vallás, az épített és a természetes közösségnek, meg közegnek a tisztelete, a népvándorlásokkal, járványokkal szembeni küzdelem, a lokalitásnak a tisztelete, ezen olyan értékek, amelyek univerzálisak, és amelyek minden történelmi korszakban minden kihívás mellett megvédésre és tiszteletre méltóak. Rod könyve ezek mellett tesz hitet egy személyes történeten keresztül, úgyhogy ebből mi is azt a következtetést tudjuk levonni, hogy jó úton járunk, ez a mi magyarok személyes története, és akkor is kitartunk ezen út mellett, hogyha kívülről érkező intellektuális gyarmatosító törekvések megpróbálnak minket eltántorítani ettől az úttól. Nagyon örülök annak, hogy ilyen komoly szerzők vannak itt a mai napon is, és általában az MCC közösségében is nagyon komoly nemzetközi tekintélyek csatlakoztak hozzánk. A Mathias Corvinus Collegium egy 25 éve létező tehetséggondozó intézmény, amelyik az általános iskolától egészen az egyetem végéig, sőt azon túl is nyújt ingyenes képzési programokat magyar fiatalok számára. Mi két alapelvben hiszünk, a patriotizmusban, a hazaszeretetben és a nemzetközi kiválóságban, és ennek alapján szeretnénk a könyvkiadási programunkat is felépíteni, aminek ez a könyv az egyik első darabja. Úgyhogy nagyon-nagyon szépen köszönöm, hogy ez a mai együttműködés az Osiris kiadóval létrejöhetett. Köszönöm a szerzőnek, hogy itt van, és hogy személyesen beszél a könyvről. Köszönöm a meghívott vendégeinknek, akik maguk is igaz hazafiak, és a nemzetközi kiválóságot képviselik, hogy arra szerződtek, hogy beszéljenek a könyvről és az ezzel kapcsolatos intellektuális küzdelmekről. Szeretném átadni a szót Boris Kálnokinak, az MCC Média Iskolának a vezetőjének, aki a mai alkalomnak a házigazdája lesz, és jó tanácskozást kívánok mindannyiunknak.
Well, thank you very much, Balázs, and welcome to our audience. I'm thrilled to be here with Rod Dreher, influential publicist, journalist, blogger, and book author in the United States. But we also have here Patrick Deneen. He is a professor at Notre Dame University and is a specialist on the history of political thought. You're interested in liberalism, conservative thought, and its relationship with liberal thought. And I was going to ask something completely different for starters, Rod, but did you understand what Balázs said in his opening speech? He said,
no, not a word.
Not really, right? So he said that your book shows Hungary is on a good way because you paint a picture, you analyze, diagnose a society that is insecure, that has lost its way, and that maybe Hungary and countries like Hungary following a policy based on the nation, faith, and family are in a good way. What do you think?
I think it's certainly the case that Hungary is at the forefront of this fight, this civilizational struggle that has overtaken all of us. In the Benedict Option, I talk about the time we're living in now as being parallel to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And the book itself is directed mostly at Christians and talking about Christian culture and worship and how we can continue to survive as Christians and keep Christian culture and Christian faith alive in this time of chaos and destruction, much as the Benedictines, the early Benedictine monks did after the fall of Rome. But there has to be a political component as well, as long as we Christians and those who are sympathetic to traditional values have that power. And one of the things that I admire much about this country, and we've seen it certainly in the past week as Hungary has been piled on by the EU for actually having the nerve to defend the family and to defend traditional values. Hungary fights, and I love that. And I don't know how long it'll be able to do it, but it is such an inspiration to people like me. I don't know what my friend Patrick is going to say, but in America, it's so easy to become discouraged when you see so many conservative politicians, in the end, refusing to fight, to take the hard stands because they don't want to be called bigots. They don't want to lose corporate support. And that's not the problem here in Hungary. And so I'm actually inspired by the courage that your prime minister has shown in taking on these big fights. And he's not afraid to be lectured to by the Dutch prime minister, and he's not going to sit back and take it.
Well, thank you, Rod, for that. Tell us, who did you write the book for? Is it for everyone, or is it just for Christians?
Well, I wrote it just for Christians, and in fact, I wrote it just for American Christians. I had no idea the book was going to become really popular in Europe. It's been translated into 10 or 11 languages now, because it seems to have struck a universal chord, or at least universal throughout the West. Christians, those who pay attention, Christians who pay attention know that our faith is in great decline. Europe has been at this, suffering from this much longer than we Americans have, but finally America has caught up to Europe in terms of decline. And in fact, my son's generation, my kids' generation, will be the first generation in American history in which a majority of people do not identify with any particular faith. So this is here. And I wrote it to, first of all, to wake up American Christians to the crisis, because so many of us live in a bubble. We can't stand to think about depressing things, but this is a reality. This is coming. Europe has shown us the way. And I would like for my children, my grandchildren, and those I want, my descendants that I won't be alive to see, I want them to hold on to the faith. And whether or not they hold on to the faith is going to depend on what people of my generation do right now in terms of pioneering a way of life and that can be strongly countercultural, able to resist the chaos and even, I believe, the persecution that is going to come to faithful Christians, so that we can not only survive that, but thrive in it. And these are the people I tried to reach, those who were capable of hearing the argument. A lot of people weren't capable of that. I got a lot of criticism from people who had not read my book, but were certain that I was saying that Christians needed to head for the hills and, batten down the hatches and get ready to live like Amish people in the mountains. That's not it at all. I say in the book that we have to live in the world. There's no escaping that. Monks and nuns can live away from the world, but as lay Christians, we have to live in the world. But if we are going to live in the world as faithful Christians, then we have to step back from that world to reacquaint ourselves with what Christianity teaches and to redevelop the habits or rediscover the habits of life in community that will provide us with the strength we need to endure. As I mentioned, Boris, I wrote this for American Christians, but it has become very popular in Europe. And I finally figured out why, after going to a bunch of different countries to talking to my audiences there, I have found that when I talk to European Christians who are my age, I'm 54, my age and older, they resist the message. They don't want to hear it. They're so committed to believing that if we just tweak things a little bit, then the church will become relevant once again and a leader in society. But when you talk to Christians who are like 40 and younger, they don't want any part of this. They know that it's over for Christians in terms of leading society and being a major part of society. At least it's over for the time being. And they don't really care about bourgeois respectability. They just want to be faithful. And there seems to be a certain likeness, I find, in Catholics especially, young Catholics who don't feel this pressure to conform to the world. They really just want to be faithfully Christian. And I find that to be so encouraging to me as the author of this book, and in fact more encouraging than talking to Americans, because I find nothing more depressing than people who refuse to live in reality. So many American Christians want to believe that we can turn this thing around if we just evangelize a little harder or elect the right person, get the right people on the bench in the courtrooms. That's not it. Europeans, by contrast, who have been living with secularization for generations now, they have a more realistic understanding, I believe, of where we are in the world as Christians. And I think that they are the answer to what we're suffering now will probably come from Europe.
Fascinating stuff. Now we will turn to Professor Deneen. And your book, Rod, has a descriptive part to it where you analyze things, and another part where you say, so what do we do? And it's a little bit the same with your book, Why Liberalism Failed, is it not? You describe, you analyze, diagnose modern society, and then you turn to the question, what do we do? And what is your assessment? Liberalism has caused problems that cannot be solved within it.
I think in contrast to Rod, I have almost no solutions. It's almost a pure diagnosis. In fact, at the end of the book, I wrote a promissory note saying effectively more to come, and that's what I'm trying to work on now. And actually, as I ended that book, I actually alluded to Rod's book, which had just come out at the time I was finishing my book, which diagnoses the condition of advanced liberal society, in which I suggest that many of the kind of pathologies that I think we recognize all around us today, some of which Rod, I think, was mentioning, a kind of a world that's been flattened, in which the sort of horizon of the divine has been eliminated, in which we pursue endlessly the sort of the pleasures of the world without ever finding satisfaction in those things. As soon as you achieve one item or good or purchase, you're on to the next one. In which we see the kind of devastation that this world is wreaking on our personal relationships, our friendships, our families, our ability to form long and stable ties with other human beings. The devastation in the United States, especially among the poorest Americans, those least well off, are having the greatest difficulty forming families, forming communities, engaging in communal life through churches and institutions. All of these things, I suggest, are indications not of the failure of liberalism, but of its success. And that's the kind of irony or maybe paradox of the book, which is that liberalism is failing because it's succeeding. So I wouldn't contest that it's doing very well in some ways, but it's leaving in its wake a kind of devastation that ideologies have tended to leave behind. And it does reflect, I think, what Rod was talking about just a moment ago, and I think what he talks about in his newest book, which I guess has still to be translated, what it is to live by a lie, what it is to form or organize an entire society based upon a lie. And the lie of liberalism is that we can do it on our own. We are radically isolated, autonomous individuals who enjoy the totality of our freedom when we are completely, in some ways, free of other connections to human beings. This is the kind of ideal model of the liberal human being. At the conclusion of that book, I suggest that one way to think about this is to look to Rod's argument in the Benedict Option, which I see as a kind of bottom-up effort to build a kind of culture, or to take the remnants of a culture, especially a Christian culture, and to revive that, which has to be a kind of bottom-up project among people in places with each other over a long period of time. But also at the end of the book, and to get back to your first question about Hungary, I also suggest what's needed is in some ways a kind of new or renewed political project. A project especially that supports those kinds of relationships, that doesn't begin with its premise that the aim and ambition of political society is to free us from each other, to free us from our parents or our children or our relationships or our religion. That a good society will be one that promotes a deepening of our relationships to other human beings, a kind of formation of stability that especially benefits those who are least prosperous, least successful in our society. This society we have built, this liberal society we have built, is actually very beneficial to a very small swath of sort of globalized, deracinated human beings who thrive in conditions of disconnection. But it's proven to be punishing on those who don't thrive in those conditions. So there needs to be a political project. And I would look to things like Hungary's family policy as one way of thinking about how it is that the political order can be seen as a support for the formation and advance of these kinds of relationships that I think are essential to human flourishing.
One thought that struck me reading your writings, Rod, but also listening to you, Professor Deneen, is seen from Hungary, it sounds so pessimistic, the end is nigh atmosphere in much of what you write, contrasts with, well, if I compare our history with your history, then nothing bad ever happened to America, and yet you guys are so pessimistic, whereas we lost to the Turks in 1526, didn't even have a state for hundreds of years, suffered communism, and yet here we are, have not lost courage and keep on going. So is that something that may be an inspiration for Americans?
Well, keep in mind that for me, the thing I'm much more worried about is the loss of Christianity, much more than the loss of liberal democracy. You know, Christians can have lived and can thrive under any number of political systems, but I'm worried about that. And I see so many forces in America today working against that, against the faith. And so that's been my primary concern. But it's also true that in the past 4 years, the acceleration of the dismemberment of American society by the left and by this ideology that has become so powerful on the left, this post-liberal, anti-liberal leftism, that's been a remarkable thing to see. And I don't want to see my country descend into low-level civil war or even actual shooting. But when you take something like critical race theory, which has now been taken up not only by every institution in America, but even by the CIA and the US military, how in the world are we going to defend our country if the military is torn apart by soldiers and officers who have learned to see each other in racial categories and to be filled with mutual suspicion? You know, it's just breathtaking to imagine that these elites who are mainstreaming this poison into the country don't understand where this is ultimately going to go. But
where is it going to go?
What's that?
Where is it going to go?
Well, where's it going to go? I don't see, we were talking about this on Sunday when Patrick arrived, that I don't see any forces emerging in American society that are capable of arresting this. I hope something does happen, but I think that the thing that worries me the most is the radicalization of the white working class and white middle class people too around racial identity. Because I've been saying for years in my writings, addressing the left, saying you can't encourage people to identify with their racial identity and to demand political power based on racial identity without calling up the same thing from the white majority. And with Christianity in great decline, what is going to be the restraining forces that keep whites from giving themselves over to white supremacy? That would be the true death of our country, and I see it as being increasingly likely.
You think it is likely there will be a civil war?
Well, when you ask where things are going, I think there are at least some hopeful signs. I'll be the bright-eyed optimist here. It's been striking even over the last several weeks and months to see the numbers of parents who are suddenly showing up to school board meetings all around the country. Now, school board meetings are among the most boring kinds of gatherings you'd ever want or not want to join, and they are usually fairly devoid of anyone attending them. There have been hundreds and hundreds of parents showing up to these school board meetings in order to protest both the advance of critical race theory in the schools and also transgender teaching in the schools. These are not typically highly political people. These are not people who spend all of their time thinking about what's the future of the Republican or the Democratic Party. These are simply people who want to raise their kids and not to have them destroyed by the educational institutions to which they send them. I think that there's a certain degree of what we could basically describe as a kind of common sense that after a period of time, whether it's under the ideology of communism, the ideology of advanced liberalism, tends to reassert itself. And you'll see it first among parents protecting their children. Whether this becomes any kind of significant political movement, I think, is yet to be seen, but it is at least a kind of encouraging sign. I also think that maybe what we've gone through over these past several years, several decades, is it's the cresting moment of the post-war American empire, a time of extraordinary prosperity, power, international might, the ability, or at least the felt or believed ability to do what we want in the world. And for the first time, at least certainly in my lifetime, and I think maybe in a lengthier period of American history, America's confronting the natural limits that being a nation in the world of history and time, I think just throws up to other nations. And you just described the kinds of terrible events in Hungary's history that America has been spared. But there's a cost to not, in some ways, suffering or undergoing sort of the realities of what it is to be a human being in a world of limits and suffering and tragedy. And maybe in a small way, experiencing these kinds of political dislocations. We could reach back to the Civil War, but we could also say that we're experiencing something of these kinds of internal divisions. There's something actually to be gained from recognizing the kinds of limits of seemingly endless prosperity, seemingly endless power, seemingly endless command over our fate. One learns resiliency from limits and tragedy. One learns how to be a sustainable nation from those confrontations. And I think the things you're describing about Hungary, one learns a kind of self-understanding, who one is, what are the sources of
So let's come to that. You both have stated that it is possible to draw inspiration from what Hungary has been doing over the past 2 years. What would be the main areas of policy making in Hungary where you could find inspiration for the United States?
I think that the things that have gotten Hungary in the greatest trouble with the European Union, the migration issue, and now the LGBT teaching among children, are for me sources of hope. I'm not as bothered by migration to America as I would be if I were Hungarian, because America is an enormous country and we have a much greater ability to assimilate. But what I like about Hungary's response was how commonsensical it was, the idea that we are a nation, and if we are going to hold ourselves together as a distinct people, we cannot allow open borders. And not only that, we have to stand firm on sovereignty and not be ashamed of who we are as a distinct people, but to act to defend that. And I think that can be, that could be chauvinistic, there's no doubt about that, and one has to be careful there. But in contrast to the constant globalist propaganda that we're hit with all the time, Hungary stood in front of that and said, no, we have another way. And I think that is something admirable. On the LGBT stuff, I write about this a lot because I'm interested in family and the disintegration of the family. We have seen over the last few years the propaganda coming out not only in schools, but in popular culture, advertising and celebrating transgenderism, for example. And now we've had Drag Queen Story Hour at the libraries, and this was the great thing, to have a drag queen come sit there in your library and read to children, to normalize this sort of disorder. And nobody stops it. It just keeps going because our media are completely bought in on it, and all the elites love it. Well, there's a reason why Hungary caused so much controversy when it passed its recent law. It's because this is not the way history is supposed to go, according to the left. We're all supposed to be self-created creatures, and our biology should have no limits to us, and anything can be family, et cetera, et cetera. We all know how this goes. Finally, unlike in the United States, Hungary has a government that stood up and said, you know what? We're going to use the power of the state to protect the family. I remember something I read Viktor Orbán said about the limits of politics. He said, I can give you things as a political leader, but I can't give you meaning. Well, in that sense, what the new Hungarian law does is it affirms that the traditional family is good and parents need the power of the state to protect them and their families from this overwhelming media propaganda that is coming from the left and from powerful international NGOs and so forth, and corporations. And I think that this creates a space within which families can create meaning for, or rather open their children's minds and hearts up to what is given in our traditions, what is given in our religion. And that is something that, as someone who's frequently frustrated with the Republican Party in the US for its lack of courage, lack of civic courage, I really find that admirable.
Well, you say the left, but I was in a TV debate yesterday about this law, and the fiercest attacks came from a Christian Democrat, an Austrian Christian Democrat politician. And if you look across the board in Western European countries, you see Christian Democrats attacking this law just like all the others. So how can that be leftist?
Are there any Christians who are Christian Democrats anymore? I mean, actual Christians?
This is so interesting because Christian Democrats in Europe never ever talk about Christian beliefs anymore.
There you go.
And I understand that you are both connected to a party in America, or support a party called the American Solidarity Party, if I'm not mistaken, which bases its views on Christian beliefs and looks towards Christian democracy as an option. But here we don't have that kind of Christian democracy, very much at least.
Well, I think the fact that probably no one has ever heard of the American Solidarity Party out there suggests we don't really have it either. And I just want to underline something that Rod was just saying about the family policy. So it's not just that members of the CDU or Christian Democratic parties would be on the right would be likely to oppose this. You're likely also to see significant opposition for this in the American conservative political order, because this represents a kind of use of government power to intervene in what should be sort of private affairs. And I think the attraction of something like American Solidarity Party, to the extent that it at least has a coherent view, it understands that there are these dual threats. And Rod has been stressing a lot the threat on the left, the progressive left, that's especially directed against traditional institutions, cultures, traditions and so forth, religion among them. But there's also a threat from the kind of libertarian right, at least as we describe it, what I think here you would call liberal, but which in the United States we call conservative. This is especially aligned with the kind of globalized marketplace, the strong ethos of contemporary corporations, the belief that the state should not intervene in the marketplace, should have a kind of free-for-all when it comes to economic competition. And I think what, at least the attraction of an alternative way of thinking about politics is to see the way that there's kind of been a deeper collusion between what passes as the left and the right, especially in American politics, that has contributed to exactly the kind of fragmentation, the dissolution of a kind of cultural set of forms and norms that neither the American right nor the left is particularly good at supporting today. So our left would like to say we should have some limits on this kind of economic, turning everything into economic competition. And the right would say, well, we should have some limits on the extent to which we simply seek the transformation of the family. But in fact, they're both working kind of hand in glove in their own spheres at advancing this dissolution. So I think the attraction of at least a kind of set of ideas that presents something different probably does harken back to an older Christian democratic understanding. But frankly, it needs to be rebuilt from the bottom up. And that requires, among other things, cultivation of culture as well as the effort to form some kind of a political movement that moves us away from this more liberal understanding of freedom.
Yeah, go on.
I'll give you an example of the kind of problem we face, of what Patrick is talking about. It used to be in American culture that big business stayed out of politics because it didn't want to be involved in controversy. They thought that was bad for business. But within the last decade, major corporations have become woke in a big way. That is to say, they've embraced progressive politics, and they have been willing to throw their economic power around in the states to fight the acts of legislatures to set policies within their own states. The major turning point in the culture war happened in 2015, and I talk about this in the Benedict Option. I hope I don't bore Hungarian readers with it, but the major point happened in 2015 when the state of Indiana in the American Midwest, governed by Republicans, passed something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a state version of a federal law that would have simply given religious believers who were sued for discrimination an affirmative defense in court. It wouldn't guarantee that they would win, but it would make things a little bit more even for them. Versions of this law had passed in any number of states prior to that, but this time, for whatever reason, big business went berserk. A coalition of companies like Apple Computer, Salesforce, and others came together and told the state bluntly, if you don't repeal this law, there will be severe economic consequences for your state. And the state legislature capitulated, and the law went away. A week later, the governor of Arkansas, which is a very conservative state, heard from Walmart, which is based there in his state, that they didn't want this law. They withdrew the bill. So that was the Waterloo for American social conservatism. When big business came in on the side of progressives, it was over. What's interesting, too, about that is that big business has learned that if it flies the pride flag, if it endorses Black Lives Matter and every woke thing that comes down the road, it can get away with treating its workers terribly, and nobody on the left really objects. You ought to go talk to Amazon drivers. They're paid little money, and they have to urinate in a bottle on their truck because Jeff Bezos wants them to be more efficient. But Amazon is super woke, has production quotas now for the films it produces, that it has to have a certain number of black people involved, and so on and so forth. You don't see people on the left or the right attacking corporations in this way because, as Patrick would say, on the right, we can't attack business, and on the left, but big business stands for all the right things. It flies the rainbow flag. What can you possibly complain about?
Okay, Rod, so you criticize big corporations, you defend the rights of workers to higher wages. Are you then a socialist?
Well, you know, I would be, this is the American Solidarity Party, right? They're socially conservative, but for a more economically, you could say socialist, or at least more of a what I would consider a pro-family policy, recognizing that the economy has to be made to work for human flourishing, broad human flourishing, not just the flourishing of the few wealthy and those who are successful enough to know how to work within the system, but there has to be a basic level of social solidarity there. But the social solidarity can't be simply economic. It also has to be at the level of culture and morals. And this is the big problem with American politics. We can't seem to get any party or politician who can marry the two. Whoever can do that will occupy the great center in American politics.
Professor Deneen, are you a socialist?
I'm a believer in sociability and sociality. No, I think what Rod is describing, and I live in the state of Indiana, so I witnessed this very firsthand and very close on. What we're actually seeing is the ability of some economic entities essentially to override democratic politics, essentially to reverse and engineer political outcomes to their liking. And I think anyone with an interest in the common good and political sovereignty should say that no corporation, no private entity should have this ability to overturn the will of the people. So when it comes to institutions or corporations that do have this ability today, I am in favor of limiting their reach and power, and if that means breaking them up or limiting how extensive that they are, I'm in favor of doing that. That doesn't make me a socialist, it actually makes me something of a capitalist, right? Capitalists recognize that monopoly is a great threat to the economic order. But I'm also a believer in and I think to echo what Rod was saying, that an economy is not simply, its sole aim or purpose is to generate wealth. That is certainly something that it ought to do, but it needs to generate wealth or prosperity in such a way that's of benefit to human flourishing. And central to that is the ability of people to form in stable communities the kind of families and relationships that I think are central to human flourishing. And if this means in ways that we have to think about the ways that law can affect or influence the economy, that it's more likely to support the kind of flourishing of human beings. And this might mean, among other things, that you're not doing the things that the Amazon drivers are having to do, that you're encouraging small businesses over the concentration of economic power and economic activity, that you're encouraging or making it possible for at least one parent to be home to raise children, rather than simply farming them off to be raised by strangers at a price. It seems to me that the market has to work for the flourishing of human beings, and our definition of prosperity has to include that. It can't just be the GDP. It has to include, are our people flourishing? Are our citizens flourishing? And do we govern ourselves? And right now I would say that we don't live in an economy in which that's true.
I think Catholic social teaching is our guide here. I'm not a Catholic, Professor Deneen is, but I think that we would probably both be old-fashioned Christian Democrats in the European sense back when they were serious about the Catholic faith and instituting those a political economy based on Catholic social teaching. But that has really gone past us now. I want to say one more thing, too, that thinking about something Viktor Orbán said during the migration crisis in 2015. He wrote an op-ed in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in which he talked about how crazy Europe's response to the migration crisis is. He said, Europe cannot remain Christian if it opens its doors. He said, Europeans are having enough trouble holding on to Christianity now without having people from a completely different religion coming in large numbers. I think that it's really hopeful and maybe a little too cheerful to imagine that Europe will become Christian or rediscover its Christianity anytime soon. Nevertheless, he was right about it in this sense, not only in terms of migration, but in terms of seeing we can't just see people as an undifferentiated mass to whom we can sell things. That there's something more important than the market. Nations matter. State sovereignty matters. Traditions of a people matter and must be defended against people like, I know his name is not popular, George Soros, who really does see the world in a liberal sense of nations being the problem, and getting in the way of the smooth functioning of the market.
So who will win the battle in the end? Will it be the global companies able to dominate policies, able perhaps even with their algorithms to change the way we see the world? Or is there hope?
Well, there's always hope, but as a Christian, I would say that hope is not the same thing as optimism. An optimist believes things will always get better, inevitably get better. I simply don't think that's true. But a Christian who has hope hopes that things will get better, but knows that even if they don't, even if we have to go through a lot of suffering, that as long as we join our suffering to Jesus Christ, and that we know our suffering has meaning, and that our sacrifice is not in vain, then we may have hope, because we know that God will use our sacrifice for the redemption of the world. And my latest book, Live Not by Lies, which is in many ways a sequel to the Benedict Option, I talked to people from this part of the world, from Central Europe and from Russia, Christians who had undergone a lot of persecution under communism, including time in jail. Nobody I talked to, not even those who had been tortured for the faith, believed that they would live to see the end of communism. But they did. This could happen. History is not predetermined. But I think that if we're going to go back to the Benedict Option, St. Benedict didn't have this plan to make Rome great again. All he wanted to do was to figure out a way to live the faith out in extraordinarily difficult times in a way that inculcated a sense of stability and continuity and, of course, fidelity in his community, and spread this community out and allowed the light and the warmth from these communities in monasteries to enlighten everyone around them. I think that is our best hope. It's not going to get solved in 10 years. It may not be solved in 100 years. But I believe that if we can plant these communities, establish these communities now and plant them and keep them going amid a lot of the coming difficulty, then our civilization does have hope.
So all that is about preserving Christianity, but not everyone is Christian. Can you govern a country based on only Christian principles, or does it need to include everyone?
Well, I mean, Rod is right that, of course, the Benedictines did not seek to make Rome great again, but they did lay the foundations for what became what we would now describe as Christendom, what we would now describe as the European civilization. They didn't begin as a political project, but out of a kind of, evangelization and an effort to introduce Christianity into places where it had not existed before, these became the centers of civilization for many communities. And doubtless there are many monasteries where towns grew up around them here in Hungary and, of course, throughout Europe. I think we need to recognize that, agreeing with Rod, that while things seem, at least from the perspective of a conservative, things seem very bleak right now, the miraculous arises from seemingly mundane activities. And if there's one thing that history teaches us, it's that when things seem the darkest, sometimes we can be surprised by this miraculous growing out of fairly mundane things. As Rod mentioned, it seemed, and I teach in political science, there was no political scientist predicting the fall of the Soviet Union in 1988. All the experts said this totalitarian undertaking will exist forever as far as we're concerned. No one could foresee this coming. So I think we shouldn't despair about the bleakness of the times that we live in. We work in the ways that we can in the various callings that we're called to, whether as an author, whether as a teacher, whether as a political figure. We all have these various callings, and we work toward those ends, not out of despair, but out of hope. And I think there's every reason to think that out of these activities, the miraculous can again arise.
You do ask an important question, though, about how can we govern without Christianity. Again, my emphasis in the book is not a political book, it's a religious and a cultural book. Nevertheless, states will be governed one way or the other. And we're not going to see anarchy unleashed in modern Europe or the United States. My fear, though, is that we will see the emergence of an order based on what the Chinese are doing with the social credit system. Right now in America, since the attacks of January 6th, which were utterly appalling, I think we all agree on that, but we have seen the national security state start to expand its definition of who was a domestic terrorist. And I believe that we will, in a short period of time, see a collusion between major corporations and the government to start identifying and monitoring a wide number of people who might be seen as dissidents from the regime. And people will become acculturated to this because we already give over so much of our personal data to these corporations who know a lot about us. there's a term called surveillance capitalism that a Harvard business professor came up with to describe this sort of thing. We have become acculturated to this in the United States, to this extraordinary level of surveillance that I'm glad to see Europe is not quite there. But I fear that the elites will ultimately use this model of surveillance capitalism and the national security state to govern an ungovernable populace. And if that happens, then we've lost our liberal democracy.
So what do? We switch off our smartphones so we cannot be surveilled anymore?
Sometimes we probably have to.
I think that we need to have politicians who push for much more robust data privacy concern or data privacy laws. But it's also a matter, again, of culture. People are not being fooled by a lot of this stuff. They're not being tricked into giving over their data. They actually want to do it. They don't see anything wrong with it. I interviewed a woman in Prague, Kamila Bendova. She and her husband, Václav, were part of Václav Havel's inner circle of Czech dissidents. She's quite old now, but she told me when I interviewed her a couple of years ago that she has no comprehension of why young people today in America and in her own country are so free to give their data over. She said, we learned back under communism that there's no such thing as the innocent collecting of this kind of information. Sooner or later, if they want to use this against you, they will. And nobody today is concerned about it. And people who didn't live through communism don't even see the problem.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. One last question. I think the time is up. What main thought will you bring back to the United States from your visit here in Hungary?
I'll certainly bring back that conservative Americans, at least, religious Americans, have a much greater friend in Hungary than we thought. The only time Hungary ever shows up in the American media is when someone is complaining about what that far-right neo-fascist Viktor Orbán has done. I was in this country maybe 10 days before I realized that 90% or more of what is reported in the American media about this country and its leaders is absolutely false. So I've been trying to use my platform at the American Conservative just to talk about Hungary. It's not paradise. Viktor Orbán is not a saint. But what's happening in this country is a sustained pushback to the inevitability of global progressivism. And I think it's tremendously encouraging. I've been telling a lot of my friends, and Patrick can vouch for this, come to Hungary. Come see what's happening here and take heart. It can be done.
I think as Americans we tend to think that we have the answers to everything, and this is again the legacy of at least 50 or 60 years of having been the world hegemon and telling the world what to do. Having been here just very few days, and having had the French lose my luggage, so I have nothing to learn from the French.
Not lose your luggage in
yes.
Paris. It's impossible.
I think especially as conservatives, we really do have a lot to learn from Hungary. It's not going to be the same, we're not going to have the same applications of these lessons. But I think what we do need to learn is that a kind of an understanding that the use of political power to both provide a relative degree of both economic security as well as social security, especially for the support of families, is something that as conservatives living in this time and place, in an age of technology, of global capital, in other words, an age that fragments, that shatters, and that destabilizes, the only likely source for at least the practical everyday experience of human beings is going to at least come from the laws. It will also come from places like the churches and the communities. But in order to protect those spaces, we're going to need the help of the laws. And this runs contrary to a deep-seated sense of what it is to be an American. That to be free means that we have to be free of the government. I think we have a lot to learn about what will be the best protector of freedom, a kind of genuine freedom, in a world in which you could say the arrangements of the world are the deepest threats to a genuine kind of human flourishing, which I think is the deepest form of freedom that we can experience.
Well, this has been an absolutely amazing evening, and I think the main thought that stays with me is the sense of cross-fertilization, where a book like yours can give so much to so many people here in Europe, and we here in Europe can give so much to further inspire you. Thank you very much for your thoughts, and goodbye.